We have Paul Von Ward on the line, and we are going to go to him now. Welcome and good evening to the show, Paul. You're on the air.
Thank you very much. Delighted to be with you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to have you here. So we're here to discuss your work on the soul genome, and your work is a work in spirituality overall. But you didn't begin that way. How you actually started out as a Protestant minister. Can you give us a little bit of background information as far as your progression possibly into a more spiritual belief system in actually natural spirituality?
Sure. Like everyone else, I grew up in an established culture that had a lot of influence on my early development. I think most of us come into life and get engaged initially that way, and some of us stay in the same sort of cultural framework or mindset the rest of their lives. But most of us actually evolve over time. And I grew up in the rural backwoods of northwest Florida back in the 40s and the 50s, and the only sort of intellectual stimuli, I guess one would say, that was available at that time was that of local fundamentalist religious groups of one sort or the other. So I developed in that fashion. But I remember very vividly when I actually joined the church and was saved, as the terminology was used in those days, at age 12. But the next day,
Paul,
yeah.
I'm actually reading this in the shtf411.com chat room. Can you speak up a little bit? I think they're having a hard time hearing you.
Okay, well, let's see. You want to test the volume? Is it going now?
Yeah, I think that's much better, yeah.
Okay, well, I'll just try to hold the receiver a little bit more directly in front of my mouth. And to make that story short, I grew out very quickly as I went off to college and started particularly reading in comparative religions and philosophy, and finding out that the world was very different than the very narrow-minded community that I had grown up in. So by the time I was in my junior year or senior year in college, I had developed very much, though, in the church, and had been ordained as a minister. And in fact, as I started graduate school, I had a small church outside of Tallahassee, Florida. But during the first year of graduate school, I had some experiences with people who really changed my perspective. One of them was the renowned Protestant theologian Paul Tillich, who came to our university, and talked to him about definitions of God. And when this great theologian sat there in front of our little group and said, well, it depends on your definition. And I began to say, okay, well, let me think about what my definition is. And for a long time, ever so often, I would write down my definition of God. And years later, when I looked at it, I really made some radical shifts as I studied other religions and met other people. And so I left graduate school and went into the Navy and then in the Foreign Service, and traveling around the world for 15 or more years to many, many countries, reading many historical text and religious text, and looking into the cultural belief systems of many different societies on the planet. And I came to some sort of what I call eclectic, natural spirituality as a way that I found satisfactory to merge what I had learned as a student of science in college and university, and looking at the belief systems that people had about humans being something more than physical beings, biological beings. There was something deeper and more multidimensional about that. And so I've over the years, after I had a lot of activities in this cross-cultural career that I've had. I've been writing now for the last 15 plus years. Books like those that you mentioned. One earlier one was Our Solarian Legacy, which was on multidimensional humans in a self-learning universe. That's sort of a cosmology that merges the notion of other dimensions that are not in our 4D reality that most of us experience on a daily basis.
Now, you actually, one of your very first book, I have to ask, this is actually, it's almost another show, but I want to ask because I read something. It's Dismantling the Pyramid, Government by the People. Now, when I read excerpts from that and your thoughts on it, you basically said that a people get the government that they embody, that they ask for, that
they deserve.
Yes, that it's a reflection of society.
That's correct.
Now, it just seems like it molds into everything else you're working on.
Well, I didn't think about it in those terms for about 10 or 15 years because I wrote that book, Dismantling the Pyramid, Government by the People, actually about 30 years ago. And it was a point in my life when I had been in the Foreign Service in the State Department in Washington for about 15 years. And I had been chosen by some senior officials along with a number of other young not middle age, but middle grade officials in the government. We weren't at the top, but we had a good bit of experience. And I was actually given the opportunity to go to Harvard to develop a master's degree in public administration, studying organizational psychology and government reform and all those things, because a number of people at that time, and this was taking place in the last years of the Nixon administration, and when the Carter administration began, we thought we had a lot of opportunity to make some changes to reform the self-perpetuating sort of insulated bureaucracy and special interest and corporate lobbyists and so on that we know so much about today. It existed at that time, and so I wrote this book to talk about how this situation that we've worked ourselves into with a government that is not able to really reflect the needs and priorities of the citizens that have supported it. And I thought that was sort of a political book, and as I went on and worked in other areas, particularly in international cultural and educational training and so on, I left it behind. But then more recently, I have come to realize that what you say is true. The institutions that we create and that we support as a people really reflect the limitations of our own development as citizens and as communities in the nation. And so I've been talking a lot recently about the notion of self-governance. Now, as I mentioned, that book, Our Solarian Legacy, which was my first interdisciplinary cosmology that I've worked on, what came out of that and the research that I did in physics and biology and history and the social sciences and so on is that, we are actually a self-learning universe, and all species are self-learning. That is, we experiment, we have the results of our behaviors manifest in our lives, and we learn something from that experience. We either learn a lot or we don't learn very much, but nevertheless, we're self-learning people. So if we are self-learning spiritual beings, then governance should be thought of as self-governance. And so that's the theme that I've been developing more recently in articles and talks that I do, that we as individuals have the responsibility to develop a system of governance that is a reflection of ourselves. And it's that challenge that we're facing right now, that we're split. Government has become encapsulated in its own interest and its own priorities, and people who get into it become very much dependent on perpetuating the institutions for their own protection, for their own benefits. So it all does fit together.
Absolutely. You know, I want to hear about what occurred 11,000 years ago or around that ballpark. I want to hear about the ancient astronauts, but I almost feel there's a couple questions that come first. I don't know, it's the chicken or the egg type, you know, which came first kind of question. Right. But in a nutshell, what are we and where we came from, or where did we come from? I mean, now I know those are huge questions, and I'll get more in detail, but can you somewhat give us an overview there?
Well, I think that the evidence that we have from all of our sciences and all of our cultural traditions is that we are conscious beings that have been manifested by the fundamental level of consciousness from which the universe itself was created or developed. I think that as we look at the notion of the Big Bang and the traditional, conventional scientific perspective on cosmology, when we encapsulate that in the spiritual, philosophical, and religious traditions of all cultures, we began to see that we are, as Homo sapiens, simply a part of the web of conscious life on this planet, and it's now becoming more and more manifest that the possibility exists that it's throughout the universe, and we're part of that. At the same time, these spiritual traditions and what we now know as the science of paranormal phenomena and the subtle senses and that whole area of work, we are multidimensional. So, and we are in contact with other, both physical and non-physical conscious entities in the universe. So this says that where we came from is we don't really know, except that we can, I think, infer with a great deal of justification that it was pure consciousness that is experimenting with itself, and that we are part of that, and that the universe is an evolving organism, a self-evolving organism, and we are direct manifestations of that. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't get entangled with other species and other levels of life, but that each of these species is a direct manifestation of the conscious that started it all.
Now, there obviously are a lot of especially, let's say, in the Western world, we have the theory or the belief that there was a fall of mankind, that we fell, let's say, fell from grace. Do you find that to be truthful in any way or have any kind of validity? Are we somehow a reject of what we were?
Well, yeah, that to me, that's very speculative, and I think that there is not any evidence for that. I think the evidence that we have thus far is that we have been a gradually evolving species since the first hominids, walked around on this planet 5 million years ago. Now, somewhere along the way, we had different rates of evolution, sometimes very slowly, sometimes very much more rapidly. And also, the thesis of my book, God's Genes and Consciousness, is that at one point in that evolutionary path where we were working on our own development in a natural setting, we had beings more advanced than we were at the time intervene in our development. And this is the story of the Anunnaki in the Sumerian tablets, the gods of the Sanskrit and Vedic literature, the gods of Greek and Roman history and Egyptian stories, and even the natural aboriginal groups that we've got around the world. They still still have the stories of interventions by advanced beings from the skies. So what happened as a result of that, human beings both learned a lot of things that were new and more advanced than they had before, but they also became dependent on and developed a sense of inferiority vis-a-vis these advanced beings. Now, I think the fall theory is simply part of the mythology of supernaturalism, that is the development of the notion that there are these gods who are divine and we are not divine. And we developed this myth that somehow we used to be divine and then we fell from grace. And that is a story and interpretation that I think has developed by the advanced beings themselves. I mean, we were obviously less developed than they were. They came in spaceships. We were still growing our vegetables and hunting animals and developing small communities on planet Earth. So there was that sense of a discrepancy between the level of culture and level of society.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't mean that we had fallen. And I think the concept of the fall was taken over basically by Western Christianity, Roman Christianity, to tell humans, you know, you're unworthy, you have to join the church, you have to go through the rituals of initiation and so on that we expect you to go through, and you must obey us as the priest and the popes and so on, and you must give your resources to support the church and its activities and so on. But that was just used as a control mechanism. Now, there is another theory about the concept of the fall, and that's a theory that we as conscious beings have an integral body that exists both while we're incarnated here. It also has these other dimensions which exist on another level, and the fact that we are born in physical form is sort of a fall from that ethereal, more subtle existence that our conscious mind, for the most part, inhabits. So that's another theory of the fall. William Thompson, a guy who has been well known for writing about this theme many years ago, articulated that very well.
Mm-hmm. Now, there are, to finish up that level of questions, I've got one more question. It's actually from a forum member participating in the SHTF411.com chat room. He says, what he wants to know, how can there be no proof of a fall? He says that our cells should always regenerate, yet the code to cause that seems to be turned off. He's asking if that does not show. I think he's trying to ask, was there genetic manipulation, that possibly we had genetic manipulation via higher life forms?
Well, I think we had genetic manipulation, but it was to actually go in the opposite direction. In other words, we were, we were merged with the genetic potential of more advanced life forms. And if we look at the fossil record and the genetic record from, say, Homo erectus, which I think is the sort of last natural developing group of humans, the Neanderthal, I think, were also part of the manipulation. So about 250,000 years ago, both the fossil record and the genetic record shows a tremendous jump, a leap, and some people call it the missing gap in our evolution. And not only was it a physical upgrade it was also an intellectual upgrade by the instruction of humans, by these advanced beings, teaching us technology that they already had developed, the mathematical systems, knowledge about the universe. All of these things were taught to us. That this is part of the technical assistance that we got from more advanced beings. And in fact, we were going along pretty well. And then they decided to pull out, according to the Anunnaki story. They were called the Anakim in the Old Testament. Pulled away and then left humans here. And we look in history and we find that about 3,500 years ago, 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, we see that these very highly developed early civilizations began to go through a period of decline and decay. And that's because the advanced beings were no longer around to keep things under control, and the local human kings and the hybrid humans who were hybrids of the advanced beings and human mothers, they were not able to keep up the level of technology and the level of civilization that we were experiencing. Now, some people think the story of Atlantis reflects that we had developed a certain level of technology and social competence, but that disappeared along with most of the existing civilizations about 11,500 years ago when we had the worldwide cataclysm that's referred to as the flood in the Bible and other similar tales from around the earth. And we have a lot of biological, geological, historical accounts that put it at about 11,500 years ago. And so the survivors who were able to escape the destruction, it was a global event apparently, with the passing through of very near to us another body. It could have been a large asteroid, another planet, something very big, enough to disrupt our magnetic fields, to cause all kinds of geological upheavals. We have mountain chains, the Andes and the Himalayas and the Swiss Alps and the Rockies, all were uplifted to greater heights about that time. And you had volcanoes erupting, sea levels changing, all sorts of physical effects of some near miss, I guess I should say, of our own planet. And so the last 7,000 years of culture has been redeveloping where we had lost it at that point in time.
Now, let me ask, we're talking about ancient history here. There are a lot of researchers out there that claim that there were different factions and that there was infighting at the same time of upheaval. Are you of that?
I'm very much of that opinion. I think Zecharia Sitchin's work, is really the greatest amount of research on this particular area that anyone has made up to this point. And he points out, and I point out in my writing, some of the conflicts and what was happening. And I'll just use an example that's familiar to most of us in the Christian culture of the United States. The notion of Yahweh and the Israelites fighting with Baal and the Babylonians. Baal and Yahweh are two names of some of those ABs, as I call them, advanced beings, the Anakim or the Anunnaki, fighting among themselves, because what happened is that these senior beings were put in charge of sort of what we might call small states or small countries or territorial areas that they were responsible for and that they used, and they had their own assistants, the humans and the hybrids, working for them. And one of the things they developed, in addition to the priesthood, which were really the interpreters and the household support staff for these advanced beings was a military function. And these ABs who were fighting among themselves used the human military to fight among themselves. So that's a tradition that we learned in that era, and we haven't gotten over it yet.
No, and that brings up the question of when we talk about these ABs, these advanced beings. In today's day and age, we have elitists. We have actual people that we can point to and say, not only did they make a ton of money in their lifetime, but generationally, their family has controlled empires. Do you believe that everyone on Earth right now is simply humankind, or are there, for example, in the elites, do they have different genetic makeup?
I don't think that in general they have significantly different genetic makeup. The only difference would be that where you have had relatively more intragroup breeding among certain families, but I don't think that it is of any great significance in terms of intellect or physical capabilities as far as the humans are concerned. And I know that there are people who believe that we have even more modern hybrids where other species have been interacting with the human genome and creating hybrids among ourselves. But I don't think those are the ruling families and so on that we see. Those ruling families have shifted as the economic makeup of cultures have changed. I mean, right now, some of the most powerful and wealthy people are people in our own culture who've developed new technologies and become quite wealthy and quite powerful from that point of view. In fact, I think the old blue bloods and the royal families that about 3,000 or 4,000 years ago claimed to be, the divine rulers on the planet because they were given their position by these ABs. Those families have been so interbred and so insulated that they no longer have that power that they had early on. Now, I think some of the institutions do, in terms of banking centers that have developed, in terms of religious institutions. Certainly, the Catholic religious institutions have remained centralized and self-controlled and self-protecting, for the last 2,000 years, almost 2,000 years. So I don't see any evidence of that. I think I see people looking out for their own interest and taking the resources from all the rest of us and using those resources to insulate themselves, protect themselves from all the other challenges that we have on the planet.
Let me ask you, when we look at what generally people call the elite, let's say, it appears that a lot of them are, for all intents and purposes, psychopaths. I mean, close to it. Do you believe that there are people that have lost their essence or their soul, let's say their spirit or soul? I mean, do we literally have just for lack of better terminology, incarnate meat walking around that has no conscience?
Well, conscience is a social construct, which develops over time and culture and learning. And I think that people who behave in a dastardly way towards other people are not any less human or any more human. I think they are simply on a different track of this evolutionary process that I talked about earlier. And some people who have been kept and trained and conditioned in a particular cult or a particular family can be very, very, how do I say, they simply don't care about anybody else. They care about only their own situation.
Mm-hmm.
But it doesn't, to me, that doesn't mean have anything to do with the absence of a soul or presence of a soul. We all have souls. We all have this multidimensional reality that's called the soul genome. So anyhow, that's my perspective on it.
Sure.
Don't really know.
Sure. Well, no, that's the purpose in these discussions and books and is a search for answers. It seems like the world is getting continually further and further away. I say that, and then other times I have cause for hope. But
right. Well, I think there is cause for hope. I mean,
go ahead.
The things that are happening politically right now in Tunisia and Egypt and so on, there is a universal yearning for the freedom and the resources to be what I have just described as self-learning, self-evolving beings. And when other beings take away that opportunity or put constraints on it, it will come out at some point or the other.
Mm-hmm. Now, in your opinion, is there any difference between a human evolution and spiritual evolution? I mean, are we like it in the Bible, Omega and Alpha and Omega, or I mean, are we just it, or are we physically and spiritually evolving beings?
I think we're both, and I think we do it at the same time. See, the notion of a multidimensional being, or the fact that we have what I would call a soul genome, that implies that we are both spiritual and physical at the same time. It's not an either or. We are connected. We are both body, mind, and spirit, if you want to use that triad as a way to think about it. Other cultures have talked about it as 5 layers. The Egyptians talked about it as 5 layers, and other cultures have different concepts. But basically, we have this three-dimensional aspects, this set of aspects, and I think that there's a lot of discussion about our higher selves, our higher beings, and this suggests that there is the possibility that the amount of our consciousness that's focused on living the daily life here on the planet has to be focused and narrowed down in terms of vision and scope of activity. But that doesn't mean that we have left behind this higher functioning, and we can access that sometimes through meditation and through just intuitive insights. And we have the saying, it's the person's better self speaking now, the lower self. So I see it, and this is not separate, from the rest of the universe. One of the things we're learning in physics today, and I think we're learning also in consciousness studies and the way the epigenome works, and the way the brain works, we are embedded in the whole thing, so that we are entangled with every dimension and every other being in the universe. All that we are is, I as a being, I'm something like a laser of light. Light is everywhere. We cohere it or concentrate it in one location in space-time as a laser beam, and we can see it, and it can do physical damage. And so our bodies are like that, in my view, that we are a more coherent, more substantive manifestation of this more ethereal self, which we cannot get rid of, and which we likely, in between incarnations, are solely in that dimension. And then we come back into the material dimension as we have in, all of our particles. I mean, they come out of the quantum plenum, and we see them as a particle or as a wave in this dimensional part of the universe, and then it's gone, and then it comes back. And so I think that all of us are part of that polarity, the light and the dark, any way, the positive, the negative. And we are organisms behaving in that web of life.
Now, in this train of thought, does this apply to animals, plants, even to the earth itself? I mean,
Absolutely.
Is it all? It is.
Absolutely. I mean, in my view, it's all the same. There are varying degrees. I mean, anyone who has pets, anyone who's worked with animals, anyone who's studied biology, anyone who has actually attempted to open himself or herself to experiencing nature, there's no way that we can get away from the notion that we are all embedded in this one huge live organism.
Now, I agree with a lot of what you're saying. I have some questions that are coming up. For example, do you believe in your soul genome? If I'm not mistaken, what you propose is that our genome, our DNA, is actually the manifestation in all realms. Is that correct? In other words, when we leave here, we'd still have that genetic holographic form, and then when we come back, that's used as a blueprint to basically make us similar.
Yeah, I like the notion of hologram. Edgar Mitchell is talking about this as a concept to sort of put a lot of his ideas together, given his experience coming back from the moon and the work that he's done as a physicist and scientist looking at all of this. And we've had talks about it, and I agree that the notion that we are in some way a holographic universe. Michael Talbot, wrote this very well-known book about 20 years ago on the holographic universe. So the notion is that we are all the whole, and each part of us is the whole, and the whole is in us. So what we have, and it's interesting, I follow, the different scientific disciplines from sort of an interdisciplinary point of view, and physics and biology is now the two together in their research coming to the view that our genome, our genes that we've talked about for the last 25, 30 years, are really only physical manifestations of patterns that we don't even know how they're functioning. And it's called the epigenome. And there's research now, I'm just reading in Scientific American the last week or so, an article where we have mainstream scientists now talking about what a guy in France 200 years ago was talking about. It was the concept of acquired characteristics, or that is learning, or the learning from our experience, gets transferred to subsequent generations. And so the soul genome concept is really along that line, that what we do in this lifetime is a coherent package of memories, patterns of energy, habits, and all of those things that are coherent enough that when we have a physical death, that is, the material matter dissolves away, this set of holographic soul genome patterns survives. It does some mingling with others in the new sphere or the collective consciousness, whatever word you want to use for that, and it probably learned something in that sphere. It also may share with other souls, with other beings, some of its experiences. So we have people coming back in incarnated form who represent the experiences of a previous lifetime, but they may also have incorporated some of the lessons learned by other beings. So my view now of reincarnation is not that we have just a tight little ball of soul that stays exactly as it is from lifetime to lifetime, but it's a much more ephemeral field of consciousness and energy that is much more interactive with similar spheres in this other realm, just the way we are on this planet. I mean, we are affected by the people around us. We affect them. We trade our diseases. We trade our knowledge, our insights. You know, it's alive. It's sort of like the brain with all the neurons and all of its axons and all of its sensory neurons and the motor neurons, all having these dendrites and synapses, keeping a flow of communication going around all the time. Nothing stops. It simply waxes and wanes. And I think that's the way the soul is vis-a-vis other souls.
Now, do you believe the soul actually resides in the DNA? I mean, does the soul have a specific home, let's say?
No. The soul, the DNA is actually the specific local manifestation of that soul. In other words, the patterns, because see, DNA is nothing but patterns. It's patterns that help form proteins, to help form the organs, help to shape life and maintain life. And what geneticists are now coming to realize is that it's not the genes per se that cause a disease or cause you to have a certain physical feature or something. It is a combination of energetic patterns, of some sort of process of turning on and off these switches that make us a little different today and a little different tomorrow. So what we call the DNA is really only a local, it's our local perception at a physical level of this larger body of patterns, memories, etc.
So the DNA would almost be a projection of the soul.
Right. That's a better way of thinking about it, because if you can think of it, normally when we use the word projection, we think of one of the old movie projectors flashing out a ray of light, and then you could see the image on the screen. What you're describing is the opposite. It's the image on the screen and the light waves coming that create the projector. So the DNA is the projector. It's the physical embodiment, if you want to use that term, of the more, and the physical is the least, is the most temporary. It's the least durable. What's more durable is the energetic and the levels of consciousness that we're embedded in.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay. Our next question, these questions are a combination of my questions along with forum member questions, so I have to try and
Great.
figure out.
They're stimulating, I must say.
Yeah. Now, there is, there's a lot of people that believe that, I can't even say believe, it feels like we literally have evil incarnate on planet Earth. We've got serial killers, we've got psychopaths, we're in wars constantly. This is let me try and see if I can phrase this correctly. The basic question is there evil? But I want to maybe move that a little further. Can an advanced soul or just a souled being, can they devolve into something that is almost a stagnant nature, of non-evolving, just stagnant and very physical?
Well, let's say first of all that good and evil are social constructs.
Mm-hmm.
From the point of view of a self-evolving, self-learning universe, there are only constructive and destructive behaviors. Now, we know that many destructive behaviors are necessary in order to be constructive. And we know that when we're trying to be constructive, we are sometimes destroying.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't want to speak in terms of good and evil. I want to speak in terms of individuals on their own paths of evolution and learning, and the mistakes that we all make. One of the theories that some people have of reincarnation is that if, let's say, you have 100 lifetimes in your past, you may have been a warrior in some instances. You may have been a bestial husband of a family. You may have been a social worker in another one. You could have been a young woman who is a creative dancer and musician in another one. And so it depends on the circumstances of how you end up in a particular lifetime and what the collective circumstances are. And any one of these activities can be seen from another perspective. For example, I was a few years ago in the south of France looking at the area where the Catholic Church would come in and burn the heretics who were in that village in the courtyard of the church. Now you would say, isn't that evil? From those people's point of view, the evil ones were being burned.
Uh-huh.
So I'm not trying to justify any destructive act, but I'm simply saying that in this universe, we do have this polarity. We do have these pros and cons. It's one of the principles. I sort of go back to the Hermetic principles from time to time because there's 7 of them that are considered to be sort of universal ideas that can account for most anything, and one of them is the principle of polarity. So that whatever you have on one side, you're going to have the opposite on the other. And that happens in our black holes, in the universe. We have universes being born, and we have black holes sucking galaxies, or star systems, into them and destroying them. So in a universe like this, you have got construction and destruction. And it goes back and forth, and there are times, as you say, when people are behaving in a retrograde manner. In fact, they're doing worse than they did before.
Well, sure. That's where I was going with that. I mean, if we're looking at it from the creation standpoint or a creative, destructive standpoint, you're making my point as far as it seems like we're in a time where there are people that are very, very imbalanced on the destructive.
Right, yeah. All of us have a little bit, and some have more. Mm-hmm. No one is a perfect paragon, and no one is a complete devil, We're all on a continuum. That's one of the things that we notice about nature. Everything is on a continuum. There's nothing that is exact. There is no set of DNA on this planet that is completely matched by another. there's no solar system matched by another one that's exactly like it, and on and on. You know, you can see that everything has this sort of continuum of strong to weak, to dark to light, etc.
Mm-hmm. Now, do you believe that when they manipulated or intervened on a genetic level, do you believe that these advanced beings intervene on a soul level as well? I mean, is it if they manipulated one, could they have possibly manipulated the other?
No. Well, it's not separate. It's not separate. I mean, you can't have a multidimensional universe and then say, oh, well, this is not connected to the rest of it. So when we let's say when we transplant an organ from one person to another, you've probably heard the stories of someone had a heart transplant and then started loving to eat hamburgers, just like the person who loved hamburgers who gave his heart to this person when he died. So, in other words, there's no separation, no complete separation between the physical. Now, let's say the Anunnaki, let's use that example. The Anunnaki decided that they would take some Homo erectus women and put some of their own genes into the Homo erectus women and produce a hybrid. Well, with that genetic material comes all of the other things that are in the soul genome. And so you had a mixture. And this happens between cultures. I mean, look what happens when different races interbreed and produce biracial children. You know, you get a multiple layered effect: physical, intellectual, spiritual. This is part of the process of a self-evolving, self-learning universe, is the mixture among individuals. I mean, this is why we have this sexual reproduction system that we have. It actually strengthens us in the long run. And I think it happened. I think the Anunnaki intervention with humans gave us a great uplift in certain ways, and I think we as humans have screwed it up by making gods out of them and deifying them and treating them as angels and the Creator itself when they were only beings like us with a more advanced culture and a more advanced technology.
Now, what is the God gene? I mean, can you explain it to us? I mean, we all have junk DNA. What is that exactly?
Well, junk DNA, that's just a term. By the way, let me say the God gene first. There's no such thing as a God gene. All genes are of God, and God is in all genes. So, you know, from my point of view, the universe is the manifestation of the creative force itself. So there's no separation between that creative force and us as beings, individual beings in this universe. So I now forgot your question. I got sidetracked on the God gene.
I was asking about junk DNA. What is contained?
Yeah, junk DNA. See, that's another one of these things that the terminology was unfortunate. What junk DNA really was, and I think people are getting away from using that term now because we know that it's very important. It has a very important function in regulating our whole being. But what was called junk DNA was the DNA that we could not identify its purpose initially. Mm-hmm. In other words, we were able to identify the functions of a certain number of genes, and we could see that they were involved in the production of protein in our cells, and mitochondrial DNA were engaged in the process of developing energy within the cell to do the synthesis work that's necessary for the reproduction of the cell itself and so on, and the repairing of the cells. But what we've come to understand is that this other 95% also has an impact on who we are and what we are and how we behave and so on. And it seems to be that a number of this, or a portion of this, somehow affects the on and off switches of the normal DNA functions. Because you can take a gene, and if it expresses itself in one way, you get one result. If it expresses itself in another way, you get another result. And so we are now, many articles are out now in the scientific community saying, whoops, we made a mistake when we were going with the genome and saying every gene has its function and we can cure a disease if we know the right gene. We can determine what trait is going to be in that new baby because it has this particular gene. Well, it didn't work out that way. What we now know is that it is a much more complex process, and it involves this process of the epigenome, which maybe even has to do with learning, experience, knowledge, not things that are physical. So we're more complex than we could ever have imagined.
Sure. Let me ask you, how does one start down the path of discovering who they were in a past life? Have you been able to figure out some form of formula as far as aiding people in seeking that information?
Well, I don't think there's any one particular formula. I think that the first step you take is to look at who you are now. And to the extent that you can look at who you were when you were very young, you are, according to the psychoplasm hypothesis that we're working with in the reincarnation experiment, is that the psychoplasm is a container, if you please, a carry forward, the transfer of past life legacies in several areas. One of them is in the genotype and the phenotype. This is the physical characteristics. The other four areas are what we call the psychological factors, and one of them has to do with your mind, with the way you think, the way your brain operates, the way you approach new problems, the environment, how you interact with ideas and other people, so that we are all different in that way, but we in psychology have been able to divide us up into different kinds of groups to say, this is an intuitive person, this is a rational person. In the personality interpersonal area, we say, this person is more of an extrovert than an introvert, and vice versa. And then we talk about emotional people. This person is very warm, and this person is cold as an ice cube. We have all these terms. You can use just about any set of psychological measurements that you want to sort of get a profile of yourself. But on the website, reincarnationexperiment.org, we've got some research forms there that people can look at, and you look at yourself. Say, what is the core essence of who I am? And then you have a sense that, well, to have this core essence today, I must have had some past lives that contributed to it. I had lives with experiences that contributed to it. So that if you were an outdoorsman and sports person, you have had something along those lines. If you are a nerdy researcher in the lab or the library, you have a sense of that past. If you are in the military and want to be on the action front, wherever that is, That's going to tell you something too. So the first step is to know who you are, because who you are is a result of what you have been, who you have been.
Now, that poses some interesting questions, and I'm going to inject one from the chat room right now.
Okay.
And I want to expand on it a little bit. The basic question is, are societal embraced morals a reflection of spiritual growth of the group as a whole? So if you'll answer that one, and I'll throw in my curveballs as
Yeah, well, I think collectively the morals and the culture of the society reflect the level of the soul development of the members of that society. Now, we know that some people have more dominating influence and others have less dominating influence. But when you put the whole thing together, you know, you are creating your own reality.
So the curveballs that I wanted to throw in there
are,
can a society, well, I should ask first, is do you believe that there are different soul groups on planet Earth right now, whether that be of possibly alien origin as far as they weren't always human, or just even in age itself? Are we literally dealing with actual soul groups? Like, could you look at, let's say, China and say that's soul group X, and they are, 10 million years old compared to Russia that's 6 million years old, or are you following that line of thinking?
Yeah, I'm following that, and there's no way to prove one conclusion or the other. But my work with a lot of different groups involved in past life research and looking at a lot of different cases, and not only mine, but also the cases of Ian Stevenson, who's a well-known psychiatrist for 40-something years working at the University of Virginia. He's looked at that question in some small way, as have other people. And the evidence seems to suggest that people have been in different cultures and in different societies, different races, either one sex or the other, different religions or ethnic groups, and that there's not we don't have distinctly separate groups in that sense. Now, you may have a preponderance of, let's say, China, got 1 billion plus people. You probably have more people in that society who have had past lifetimes as Chinese or that Asian people, in the same way you would have perhaps in Africa or in Europe. But it does not necessarily mean that everybody who's in the Caucasian community in the United States at this point, the evidence suggests that many of them who are in the Caucasian community in the United States before have been in the African community in Africa or in the United States. There have been Orientals who are here, and people who are in Europe or Africa now may have had a past life in the United States. So I don't think it's clear cut. I do think that there are souls who have been evolving over many more lifetimes than others, and I think that some souls have probably made more progress in their learning and in their self-development than others. So we're not all the same. The notion that all souls are equally pure and equally perfect and everything is, at that level, some ideal dimension. I would say that that's not the case, that we are all in varying levels of development and experience and so on. And we have had many, many different experiences in the past and it would make sense that we would go from one race to the other, to one area of the globe to the other, because that's how you can learn by experiencing the differences. You learn much more when you do that than when you stay in the same area of experience.
Now, my other question I was going to ask is can it possibly be that a society is destructive to some people's souls, as far as do people get born into a society that, when you're talking about getting to know yourself in order to find yourself who you have been, but the societal constructs teach you flat out that reincarnation isn't real, or everything that you think is you, they basically wash that away and say, no, you're this.
Yeah. Absolutely. And this is one of the areas that interests me most in my research in this soul genome area. And we have no way of proving it, and I'm just looking for anecdotal evidence at this point. But the notion of the interplay between the mundane life that we live in this incarnate form and its influence on the soul dimension, and vice versa, because I think there's an interaction going on there too, which means that, yes, we can get into societies that get off track. I mean, there are a lot of people who think our society has gotten off track in the sense of materialism, our selfishness, our warring mentality, our disregard for nature, our disregard for living healthily with one another. I mean, you can make all these points, and I think they're valid. And I think that is affecting, the other dimensional aspects of all of us. I mean, we don't just leave this earth and go back to some pure heaven somewhere. We take back with us what we've done and learned on this planet. And if we've learned negative things, if we've learned retrogressive behaviors, then I think we're affecting the whole being that we are.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you can see underlying my philosophy and my work and writing is that the universe is a natural universe. It is a universe of laws and principles, and we are part of that. And we can't fool ourselves by creating these magical heavens and magical ideas that are inconsistent, with the way the universe works. I mean, we can't say, gee, the sun decides one day that it will not shine again, or the sun decides one day that it will just expand its flares and fry everyone on the earth. No, the sun goes according to the laws of nature, just like we and the earth survive or not survive. And so we have to keep in mind that, at least from my perspective, that we should beware this notion of perfect ideal philosophy or perfect ideal religion or the perfect scientific theory. I mean, hell, everything is in a process of change and evolution. And in fact, if it is that kind of a universe, then we are creating our tomorrow by the way we behave today.
Now, you bring up some good points, and we're in the modern age where it does seem like there's upheaval everywhere we turn, whether it's war or you've got these countries across now northern Africa. Well, it was Europe, now northern Africa, rioting, government leaders fleeing. You've got the United States warring all across the world in almost an empirical fashion and going broke at the same time.
Right.
Do you see the presence of advanced beings or change towards, in other words, it seems like we're going from an old paradigm of very harsh control. I mean, you could look at the countries in North Africa or even Europe, and you had a very established aristocratic type ruling there, and then lower regular people. And somewhat, as of late, in the last 20 years, we've kind of gotten that in the United States. Do you see change on the horizon? I mean, are we going to see advanced beings coming to the forefront again? I mean, what are we seeing right now? Because this does play into our modern day and age.
Well, the thesis that I articulate in the book, God's Genes and Consciousness, is that the level of intervention in human history has vacillated over the ages. And I think the direct rule where, the AB sat on the top of the ziggurat and had a human woman taken to him as a sacrifice for the night, that ended in an overt way about 3,500 or plus years ago. But I do think that there's still ongoing intervention and involvement. I think it's happening on a positive level, if you want to use that term, or let's say constructive level, and it's also happening on a destructive level. None of us can put all the pieces together right now. I mean, I follow the UFO, the ET research literature. I follow the spiritual, higher beings, ascended masters, all of that activity. And I'm not an expert in any of those areas, but I try to have enough awareness of what's going on there to know that there seems to be, at least the human perception, that we're getting some good advice and good suggestions from some groups, and we're getting destructive and even intervention and control of us on some other groups. So I don't know how to answer your question there. I think that we are going through a period of upheaval and turmoil because this is part of the cycle. Once you build up certain cultures, certain institutions, and what happens inevitably, apparently, is that they get so stuck on themselves that they get out of touch with the rest of the planet. And so what happens is this rising up from the bottom to tear down these structures, like my book, Dismantling the Pyramid, and then you get a new cycle. So I think that we probably look at these things like the charges of advanced beings, coming and saving us from ourselves, or on the other hand, coming to take us over. On the other hand, I think those are rather simplistic, idealistic concepts, and we need to keep in mind that it's an ongoing, I think the theme that would go through my book there would be, we've never been alone. The degree of interaction has vacillated over years.
Mm-hmm. Now, what comes to mind is a phrase I don't know, it popped in my mind, and I wanted to do something with it, but I haven't done anything with it. But it basically goes, it's all a school until graduation day. When we graduate is the day we leave this earth, meaning the physical end of our lives. Do you believe that soul groups will leave this earth? Are we constantly, eternally incarnated here, reincarnated here, or do we graduate and go elsewhere permanently?
Well, my belief is, and this is solely a belief, I believe that we, as individuals, evolve individually, and that I suspect that at some point individual souls may evolve into remaining in one of those other divisions or other dimensions, after so much time on this planetary incarnation. Now, I wouldn't state that it would be impossible that some of us may very well have interplanetary incarnations and so on. I think that why not? I mean, if life is somewhat connected and similar throughout the universe, where you are physically could change from time to time. But I don't think we ought to think about the notion of I'm living this lifetime, I'm learning my lessons, and I'm going to graduate and go on forever for some other time. I think most of us are probably still in the process of coming and going.
Mm-hmm.
And it's better to think that way because it means that we'll be more responsible and more sensitive and more careful about the way we live this lifetime if we think we're coming back and going to have to live in the mess that we've created. Or the Garden of Eden that we've created,
Now, we've got about 10 minutes left, so we've got a little bit of time. Do any of the people that speak on reincarnation, do they ever recall what happened between lives? And if so, were their experiences similar?
Well, guy Michael Newton has written a book about a lot of cases that he's worked with, and that suggests there's this commonality and so on. The problem with that kind of material is it's very subjective, and we have no way of validating it. And in fact, you can't even use the notion that 1,000 people said something similar when they've been processed by the same person or the same process, which may very well determine the outcome. I mean, we know that from social sciences that you can have contamination and auto-suggestion and external suggestion for creating this material. But I do think that if one looks at a lot of different areas, including channel material from so-called ascended masters and others, I do think that there is a period of consciousness, and it would certainly make sense that if we are quite conscious in this incarnation, and that if we lose our physical blinders, we would probably be even more conscious. And so therefore there should be a reflection and sort of self-evaluation and talking to other beings about the experiences they've had and sharing what everyone has learned. This is a way to make progress. It's like we get out of school in the end of May and we meet up with our friends from elsewhere in the summer and we learn from each other and share ideas and so forth, and then we go back to school in September and start over again. So that makes sense to me, but I don't think we have any empirical evidence to support it.
Now, we're coming close to the hour, so I've got one last quick question. Hopefully it's not too monstrous of one. It's posed from one of our listeners in the chat room right now. Reincarnation seems to impose a finite number of souls, yet our population seems to be ever expanding. Are there new souls being created?
Well, I think the answer to that is that for us to say anything is finite is rather arrogant. We have no idea what the potential and possibilities are in the universe at large. And the fact that we have so many people, I've done the math on this a couple of times with people who are population experts. We could handle the 6 billion that we've got based on souls that have come into life for one lifetime or others because of such short lifetimes in the early days of our species. But I don't think that's an issue. I think if we are a self-evolving universe and that we are a conscious-based universe, then the creation of new, not only souls in our species, but the creation of new species as they evolve from one place to the other in the universe, I don't think that's even an issue. We don't know how these things split up. We don't know. I mean, it's like, two parents can have many kids. You can have identical twins. We don't understand how these physical principles work at that level of the soul genome. But I think that there's not any problem of having a continual supply of conscious entities incarnating in physical form. In fact, maybe that the one possibility that I've thought about is that the soul doesn't start until it has one life form, and then from that life form goes the soul continuing on a path of reincarnation.
Interesting.
Yep.
All right, sir, we're down to 4 minutes on the show. We like to ask all our guests if they have any charities they'd like to plug. Do you have yours?
Well, given my sort of international orientation and work in so many different countries, I tend to look towards international charities, and one that I've been supporting this last year is International Rescue Committee at IRC. One can go on the web and check them out. They are very, very active in any kind of disaster, tragedy. They were very active in Pakistan and Haiti and other places this past year that suffered from cataclysmic physical events like flooding and earthquakes and that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. Another one that I really like to mention is the Doctors Without Borders, or the Médecins Sans Frontières. It started in Europe, and that was the name, and now it's in English, Doctors Without Borders. They work in places that are dangerous. They work where people have really suffered from war, revolution, natural disasters, and helping people in the most urgent need. And I support them on a regular basis and would recommend other people to have a look at them. Had a lot of activities in this cross-cultural career that I've had. I've been writing now for the last 15-plus years. Books like those that you mentioned. One earlier one was Our Solarian Legacy, which was on multidimensional humans in a self-learning universe. That's sort of a cosmology that merges the notion of other dimensions that are not in our 4D reality that most of us experience on a daily basis.
Now, you actually, one of your very first book, I have to ask, this is actually, it's almost another show, but I want to ask because I read something. It's Dismantling the Pyramid, Government by the People. Now, when I read excerpts from that and your thoughts on it, you basically said that a people get the government that they embody, that they ask for, that
they deserve.
Yes, that it's a reflection of society.
That's correct.
Now, it just seems like it molds into everything else you're working on.
Well, I didn't think about it in those terms for about 10 or 15 years, because I wrote that book, Dismantling the Pyramid, Government by the People, actually about 30 years ago. And it was a point in my life when I had been in the Foreign Service in the State Department in Washington for about 15 years, And I had been chosen by some senior officials, along with a number of other young not middle age, but middle grade officials in the government. We weren't at the top, but we had a good bit of experience. And I was actually given the opportunity to go to Harvard to develop a master's degree in public administration, studying organizational psychology and government reform and all those things, because a number of people at that time, and this was taking place in the last years of the Nixon administration, and when the Carter administration began, we thought we had a lot of opportunity to make some changes to reform the self-perpetuating sort of insulated bureaucracy and special interest and corporate lobbyists and so on that we know so much about today. It existed at that time, and so I wrote this book to talk about how this situation that we worked ourselves into with a government that is not able to really reflect the needs and priorities of the citizens that have supported it. And I thought that was sort of a political book, and as I went on and worked in other areas, particularly in international cultural and educational training and so on, I left it behind. But then more recently, I have come to realize that what you say is true. The institutions that we create and that we support as a people really reflect the limitations of our own development as citizens and as communities in the nation. And so I've been talking a lot recently about the notion of self-governance. Now, as I mentioned, that book, Our Solarian Legacy, which was my first interdisciplinary cosmology that I've worked on, what came out of that in the research that I did in physics and biology and history and the social sciences and so on is that, we are actually a self-learning universe, and all species are self-learning. That is, we experiment, we have the results of our behaviors manifest in our lives, and we learn something from that experience. We either learn a lot or we don't learn very much, but nevertheless, we're self-learning people. So if we are self-learning spiritual beings, then governance should be thought of as self-governance. And so that's the theme that I've been developing more recently in articles and talks that I do, that we as individuals have the responsibility to develop a system of governance that is a reflection of ourselves. And it's that challenge that we're facing right now, that we're split. Government has become encapsulated in its own interests.
We have Paul Von Ward on the line, and we are going to go to him now. Welcome and good evening to the show, Paul. You're on the air.
Thank you very much. Delighted to be with you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to have you here. So we're here to discuss your work on the soul genome, and your work is a work in spirituality overall. But you didn't begin that way. How you actually started out as a Protestant minister. Can you give us a little bit of background information as far as your progression possibly into a more spiritual belief system in actually natural spirituality?
Sure. Like everyone else, I grew up in an established culture that had a lot of influence on my early development. I think most of us come into life and get engaged initially that way, and some of us stay in the same sort of cultural framework or mindset the rest of their lives. But most of us actually evolve over time. And I grew up in the rural backwoods of northwest Florida back in the 40s and the 50s, and the only sort of intellectual stimuli, I guess one would say, that was available at that time was that of local fundamentalist religious groups of one sort or the other. So I developed in that fashion. But I remember very vividly when I actually joined the church and was saved, as the terminology was used in those days, at age 12. But the next day,
Paul,
yeah.
I'm actually reading this in the shtf411.com chat room. Can you speak up a little bit? I think they're having a hard time hearing you.
Okay, well, let's see. You want to test the volume? Is it going now?
Yeah, I think that's much better, yeah.
Okay, well, I'll just try to hold the receiver a little bit more directly in front of my mouth. And to make that story short, I grew out very quickly as I went off to college and started particularly reading in comparative religions and philosophy and finding out that the world was very different than the very narrow-minded community that I had grown up in. So by the time I was in my junior year or senior year in college, I had developed very much, though, in the church and had been ordained as a minister. And in fact, as I started graduate school, I had a small church outside of Tallahassee, Florida. But during the first year of graduate school, I had some experiences with people who really changed my perspective. One of them was the renowned Protestant theologian Paul Tillich, who came to our university, and talked to him about definitions of God. And when this great theologian sat there in front of our little group and said, well, it depends on your definition. And I began to say, okay, well, let me think about what my definition is. And for a long time, ever so often, I would write down my definition of God. And years later, when I looked at it, I really made some radical shifts as I studied other religions and met other people. And so I left graduate school and went into the Navy and then in the Foreign Service, and traveling around the world for 15 or more years to many, many countries, reading many historical text and religious text, and looking into the cultural belief systems of many different societies on the planet. And I came to some sort of what I call eclectic, natural spirituality as a way that I found satisfactory to merge what I had learned as a student of science in college and university, and looking at the belief systems that people had about humans being something more than physical beings, biological beings. There was something deeper and more multidimensional about that. And so I've over the years, after and its own priorities, and people who get into it become very much dependent on perpetuating the institutions for their own protection, for their own benefits. So it all does fit together.
Absolutely. I want to hear about what occurred 11,000 years ago or around that ballpark. I want to hear about the ancient astronauts, but I almost feel there's a couple questions that come first. I don't know, it's the chicken or the egg type, which came first kind of question,
Right.
But in a nutshell, what are we and where we came from, or where did we come from? I mean, now I know those are huge questions, and I'll get more in detail, but can you somewhat give us an overview there?
Well, I think that the evidence that we have from all of our sciences and all of our cultural traditions is that we are conscious beings that have been manifested by the fundamental level of consciousness from which the universe itself was created or developed. I think that as we look at the notion of the Big Bang and the traditional, conventional scientific perspective on cosmology, when we encapsulate that in the spiritual, philosophical, and religious traditions of all cultures, we began to see that we are, as Homo sapiens, simply a part of the web of conscious life on this planet, and it's now becoming more and more manifest that the possibility exists that it's throughout the universe, and we're part of that. At the same time, these spiritual traditions and what we now know as the science of paranormal phenomena and the subtle senses and that whole area of work, we are multidimensional. So, and we are in contact with other, both physical and non-physical conscious entities in the universe. So this says that where we came from is